title of this.
We are Sex
Let me make you stasis. Mama, serpentine. I got a breathalyzer.
We are from Miss White's 5th period English 12 class, and this is Scott Pilgrim versus the Feminist and Cultural perspective.
This will contain heavy spoilers for the Scott Pilgrim comics, movie, and animated series.
In the comic and film iterations, Scott Pilgrim is taken on a wild journey, defeating Ramona Flowers' 7 evil ex-boyfriends to earn her affections. We open with Scott Pilgrim, 23, dating a 17-year-old girl, Knives Chow. Suddenly, he meets and falls for Ramona Flowers, two-timing both until he breaks it off with Knives. Scott and Ramona get together, and he is given the task of defeating the League of Evil Exes, Ramona's past lovers with bitter sentiments towards her, formed by her evil ex-boyfriend Gideon. As he progresses, Scott is faced with his own flaws and must learn to be a better person. At the end, Scott and Ramona defeat Gideon and the two jump into subspace together, wondering where their future will go next.
In Scott Pilgrim vs. the World by Bryan Lee O'Malley, misogyny and toxic masculinity in both implicit and explicit form is rampant. Using the lenses of feminist and cultural criticism, we can analyze how O'Malley has created the characters Ramona Flowers and Scott Pilgrim, and how they are flawed as people and in reception by audiences.
Cultural criticism is defined as a form of criticism that examines how different religions, ethnicities, class identifications, political viewpoints, and individual viewpoints affect the way texts are created and interpreted. Cultural criticism suggests that being a part of or being excluded from a specific group or culture contributes to and affects our understanding of text according to the Springboard textbook. Today, we will apply the assumption that an examination or exploration of the relationship between dominant cultures and marginalized cultures is essential to Scott as a character and unpack how he is a representation of toxic masculinity.
Scott, if your life had a face, I would punch it.
Yeah. Wait, what?
Kim Pine, Scott's friend, says this to him out of minor feelings of hatred. Throughout the entire film and comic, Scott glides through life and seemingly lives without consequences. His friends serve as morality checkers as his actions are repeatedly questionable. Scott is a satirical portrayal of toxic masculinity, being seen as a sort of hero to those like him. According to Caitlin Andrews on MovieWeb.com, why should Scott, as a complicated and well-rounded protagonist, be expected to uphold the moral values of his audience when it's likely that the majority of his audience is not even doing that? Some of his actions may be justifiably questionable from an external perspective, but it could be argued that Scott's representation as a post-adolescent male who believes he is the leading man in everyone's lives is an accurate testament to the lived experiences of actual real-life quirky young men. Applying this to our assumption, an examination or exploration of the relationship between dominant cultures and marginalized cultures is essential, we can see here a clear representation of the ego of toxic masculinity being satirized. Truthfully, the entire movie and novels are aware of their own irony. Everybody who isn't a Scott themselves sees how the entire concept is to make light of how ridiculous this situation is that only applies to the male gaze. Scott's friends tell him how awful he is. He is written to be unlikable. Where the movie fails to show Scott receiving his dues, the comic shows him realizing the true gravity of his mistakes. Andrews also states that Scott Pilgrim is the story's protagonist, or more accurately, anti-hero, but his questionable behavior isn't without consequence. The film doesn't prop Scott up on a pedestal where he can't be touched. His peers criticize his behavior, and the one-dimensional ideation of his female counterparts leads to his eventual demise. When viewing Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, it's more important to keep in mind the purpose the film's anti-hero serves within the universe rather than the individual characterization of the protagonist. Kim's snarky comment serves as a basis for Scott's place in the universe to truly be shown. If somebody glorifies him or only focuses on how awful he is, they miss the entire point of the story.
According to Springboard, the feminist lens focuses on relationships between genders. It examines the patterns of thought, behavior, values, enfranchisement, and power in relations between and within the sexes. In analyzing the character Ramona Flowers, the assumption that fictional portrayals of female characters often reflect and reinforce stereotypical social and political attitudes towards women can be observed in her misogynistic characterization.
I was like this totally serious kid and this totally angsty teenager. I probably only smiled and laughed when I was deluded into thinking it would make some jerk like me.
As shown here, Ramona acts in the interest of men. Many facets of Ramona's character can be seen as the perfect girl for a socially isolated man, aloof, colorful, and mysterious, a manic pixie girl. In her character, she has internalized this misogyny, trying to find companionship in the men who will view her as a stereotype. Her portrayal as something for underdog men to long for and protect means that she loses her voice, becoming an outdated, traditional version of a woman, existing only to serve men. Laura Mulvey, in her blog post, Scott Pilgrim's Toxicity versus Women in the World, an Oppositional Gaze, provides an analysis on Ramona's character. Ramona isn't able to play a part, nor have a say in her own liberation from an abusive relationship, save for one physical action. Gideon, the final boss, says arrogantly, "Yeah, still my girl," with a smirk, before Ramona says, "Let's both be girls," and kicks him in what he cares about most, only before, of course, he slaps her and she falls again, this time literally to his feet at the bottom of the stairs. In the end, it is Scott, of course, who defeats Gideon, meaning finally he has reached the top of the hill he has been climbing to reach his object of desire, even though she's still laying on the ground below them. From this scene, it is clear how the assumption that fictional female characters often reflect stereotypical attitudes towards women applies. Ramona is the damsel in distress, the object to be saved. She herself cannot escape this mindset and thus plays into it. Ramona wants some jerk to like her so she can play into the stereotype made for her. She cannot act for herself, Scott must act for her. She cannot move past her mistakes on her own, Scott needs to defeat her exes. Additionally, Mulvey claims that Ramona is trapped within a toxic relationship. It was Gideon who formed the League of Seven Evil Exes. This indicates an abusive power dynamic between Gideon and Ramona, making him a subtle enemy to Ramona, all women, while to Scott and male viewers, this makes him an enemy competing for their object of desire. In summary, the character Ramona only exists as an object of desire for Scott and the audience. Furthermore, in the story, the character herself also believes this and acts to fulfill that role.
However, when it comes to the case of Ramona Flowers, we could also argue that rather than being a simple portrayal of a manic pixie girl or an object, Ramona is a complex and meaningful character on her own. Ramona is a real person. Ramona is flawed in the truest sense. She refuses to communicate, accept change, and runs away from everything she's been through. Her characterization is often ignored for the sake of ease. Ramona consistently tries to run away from her actions. Need I mention her treatment of Roxy, her disappearance from Scott, and her rejection of her emotions? Her motives are extremely realistic as well. Facing your actions is terrifying, awful even. When given the choice of redemption through effort or escape, most people would choose to escape. It's easy to reject yourself. It's easy to ignore any sort of wrongdoing you could commit for the ease of letting those emotions slide away. You've never done anything wrong. Why worry about it? In many ways, it's easier to run. Whenever something fails, there is always the opportunity to find something new. And when that fails, you can run again. It's an awful, self-destructive cycle that repeatedly breaks the person until they no longer see any other way of continuing. But Ramona's 7 different evil exes tell us something important. Every time she's tried to run away, it leaves the same result: vengeful emotions, depression, and regret. Her cycle is ultimately self-destructive. If she is to continue this way, she will never know true peace, living in a nightmarish world free of establishment but devoid of connection. You'll notice here too, Scott has nearly the same mindset. Scott forgets about every problem he has ever caused until the nega Scott forces him to remember how awful of a person he is. Ramona doesn't have a nega Scott. In fact, we don't see the clearest demonstration of her accepting her past mistakes as Scott does, but we do see every part of her symbolically choosing to be done with Gideon, at least in comic form. Only after they enter subspace in Ramona's purse is when Ramona finally realizes what she must do. She finally makes a substantial decision for herself. She finally leaves her isolated and self-hating ways to hopefully move on to a better future. The animation is entirely different from the comic and movie, being a sort of response to them. We follow on Ramona rather than Scott, and get to see Ramona firsthand learn from her mistakes. Ramona is forced to reconcile with Roxy. She is forced to accept what she's done to her exes, and she is faced with the result of her possible continuation of her ways. She's faced with a Scott that has been destroyed. Seeing this, Ramona finally chooses herself. Ramona finally has a character development moment where she realizes she cannot keep running from herself. So, she finally takes responsibility for herself and truly grows as a person. She becomes the most powerful version of herself when she finally accepts she has done things that are wrong, but doesn't have to be held back by it. This is what Ramona's character truly is, just like Scott, but unfortunately, this is blatantly ignored due to writing issues, a movie that doesn't portray her correctly, and an illiterate audience.
As shown through characters Ramona Flowers and Scott Pilgrim, Bryan Lee O'Malley has created a world that can be endlessly analyzed through feminist and cultural criticism. Scott is a representation of the socially inept man, Ramona, the dependent object of his desire. There is something to be said about the blatant ignorance of an audience that cannot understand flawed characters, such as the defense of the character of Ramona herself. But toxic masculinity and misogyny are clearly represented here. We as the audience must ask ourselves to think in depth regarding portrayal and characterization of women and men. What sort of message is media giving off when we consume it? What message are you predetermined to find? And is that all there is to see?